All right. Like many good things, it all started with a tweet. In August of 2019, I replied to a tweet and mentioned that I had tried out a relatively new Yarn feature plug and play. Mel, the lead maintainer of Yarn, replied encouraging me to try out Yarn 2. Now, Yarn 2 was still pre-release at that time, but I decided to give it a try, and I was impressed. I also fairly quickly encountered a minor edge case bug, which got fixed quite promptly. That was almost 3 years ago, and Yarn Berry has come a long way since then. It's more appropriate, actually, to call it Yarn Berry than Yarn 2, because Berry was the project name for the Yarn rewrite. Yarn 3 has now been released, and it's still built on top of that Berry codebase. Hi, I'm Michael Richardson, and this is Yarn Berry, a next-generation package manager. Before I get too far ahead of myself, let's talk about Yarn Classic, the 1.x version. Yarn made a big splash when it came on the scene a few years back. It was an alternative to the default package manager at the then and now, NPM. Yarn promised better performance and more reliable, repeatable builds, in part due to a unique lock file. Now, I've used Yarn fairly consistently for several years now, and I've really enjoyed using it overall. As proof of Yarn's success, many of the innovations developed by Yarn have now been incorporated into modern versions of NPM. NPM now supports lock files and has significantly improved its performance since Yarn was released. Now, Yarn Berry is the name for a significant re-architecture and rewrite of the Yarn project. It improves on a variety of features from the original Yarn, adds a few more features, and encourages a really impressive package install strategy called plug and play. Now, in prior iterations of this talk, I've simply used the name Yarn 2. And like I said, this is no longer accurate. The difference between 2 and, because Yarn 3 has been released, the difference between 2 and 3 is comparatively insignificant, almost nothing like the changes from 1 to 2. For that reason, and for clarity, I'll do my best to use the name Yarn Berry throughout the talk. You may also see Berry referred to as Yarn Modern to distinguish it from Yarn Classic. So the first and most important thing to remember is don't panic. Yarn Classic is not going away. When Yarn Berry was first released, there was significant concern in the Node ecosystem. A lot of people were concerned that things would break and the ecosystem would be harmed as a result. Now, when we get to the demo, you'll notice that I'm still using Yarn Classic as my global Yarn installation. That hasn't changed. But also at the same time, it's important to be aware that Yarn Classic is unlikely to receive any significant new features. It's where it is, and it's not going to make much changes from there. It may be upgraded for certain compatibility with Yarn Berry, things like that, but it's not going to receive any big changes. To use Yarn Berry, we're going to install it in a specific project. Now, since the release of Yarn 1.0, way back, Yarn has supported a feature that I like to call version pinning. With version pinning, you can simply embed a specific version of Yarn into your project. Once you've done this, everyone who clones your project and runs Yarn will use that embedded version regardless of what version they have installed globally on their machine. We've been using this feature for some time at Kroger, and it's worked really well for us and avoided a lot of issues. In the same way that a lock file ensures repeatable builds, this makes all your package management more consistent. So let's talk about what's new in Yarn Berry. First of all, the Yarn source code has been refactored to be highly modular, utilizing a plugin-based architecture. Much of what we would see as the core functionality of Yarn is implemented as plugins. If Yarn doesn't offer a feature or command that you want, you can add it yourself as a plugin. I hope to see a lot of interesting developments in this space. I've already seen some cool stuff coming out, and I think it'll start getting more press. Now, Yarn Berry's console output is very clean and easy to read. It clearly identifies each step in the process, bracketed on the side, and the associated warnings or errors. You'll see this as I'm running it later. Each output message has a specific code which can be easily referenced in the documentation or searched online. In some cases, it even has a little underline. You can click it, and that link will take you to a description of that message, that error, depending on this case. Now, Yarn Berry also offers enhanced support for workspaces. Workspaces were already a big selling point for Yarn Classic, but Yarn Berry has made some big advancements in this area for improved developer experience. If this is important to you, you may want to consider Yarn Berry just for this reason alone. If you use workspaces or think they might be useful to you, definitely check it out. Now, Yarn Berry also contains the new command yarn DLX, which can be used to run one-off scripts, a lot like npx, but a little bit safer. They also have new protocols like patch and portal, which are generally better than, so patch is brand new. It's kind of cool. It allows you to patch a package. This is actually used in Yarn to make it more compatible with TypeScript, which is super cool. Portal is a different version of Link, which is just handles things a lot better in a lot of cases. It also includes constraints, and these are an interesting experimental feature. Constraints allow you to specify rules about your package dependencies that Yarn will run, then Yarn will ensure that those rules are not violated. For example, you might want to make sure that all the packages in your workspace depend on the same version of a specific package, or that they specifically don't depend on a specific package. Constraints are written in a language named Prolog, a logic-based programming language. The Yarn team caught some flack for going this direction, but I think it's kind of brilliant. Prolog is specifically designed for these kind of scenarios. So, what about performance? Let's take a look real quick. Oh, one moment. So the Yarn package actually goes ahead and publishes performance characteristics for their packages at this point. So we can take a look at that. The truth is that many things are relatively similar. This can be a little tough to read and dig into, but for a lot of cases, Yarn, even using node modules, is often going to be the fastest or comparable to the fastest ones. So depending on which ones you're looking at and the scenarios that are most important to you, you can kind of go through here. So for example, in this case where you only have a cache, but you don't have a lock file, which is pretty rare, honestly, NPM and Yarn in this case is not particularly fast. But in other cases, you'll see that Yarn significantly beats out NPM, or PnPM for that matter, which is listed in a lot of places here. So, but interestingly, PnPM does their own benchmarks, and in several cases there, Yarn is actually the fastest. But again, they're pretty comparable. Most of the time with Yarn and PnPM being the fastest and NPM a little bit behind. Cool. We'll jump back in here. So, all the things that I talked about so far are nice. They improve the developer experience in a variety of ways and just make Yarn a little better and easier to use. But the real star, in my mind, is the use and plug and play as the encouraged install strategy. Now, plug and play is often shortened to PnP, and you might see that acronym occasionally in various places. So in order to understand plug and play, we should first understand what it's not, why it's different from the current method of package installation. To do that, we have to talk about Node. When resolving module references, Node looks for the appropriate file in the node modules folder using a method called require.resolve. Now, for our purposes, we don't need to know the ugly details of how resolve works. Frankly, I don't know how it works because I haven't had a need to. I leave that to package manager authors who handle that well. Until I do have a need, I have better things to do, like building software, taking hikes in the woods, and watching movies with my family. Node has resolved modules this way since the very beginning. Package managers have to be compatible with Node's resolution logic. So they have to do it Node's way, and that means copying files into Node modules. Now, this copying takes time and introduces a variety of issues, some of which you may be familiar with. For example, creating folders so deeply nested that they can't be easily deleted. Thank you, Windows, for that one. Or a node modules folder with more than 160,000 files and over 1 gigabyte in size. Now, that's what I work with sometimes at my day job. The web of package dependencies creates complex folder structures, and they always seem to get messed up. Now, you yourself may have been through this scenario if you work with Node. You're about to tear your hair out. You're trying to get your project to run. Now, in desperation, you delete the node modules folder, reinstall your packages, and magically everything starts working again. Why? We have no idea. Now, all of this sounds like a fantastic system, right? Just perfect in every way. Not so much. So how do we solve this problem? Let's say that we want to avoid these issues. How do we get around the various complications they create? The problem may seem intractable. We need packages. Life would be terrible without them. Node needs them to be properly arranged in node modules folder. In a way, we're stuck. But how can we stop playing by Node's rules and start playing by our own rules? With plug and play, Yarn uses a unique and innovative strategy. It simply overrides Node's built-in methods for module resolution. JavaScript is so flexible that you can override core pieces of the functionality and essentially say, hey, that thing over there you normally don't do that, do this instead. Now, in many cases, this can be a bit ridiculous, but in this case, it's ridiculously useful. Yarn overrides these APIs, and that allows it to get right in the middle of the module resolution process, enforcing its own rules and implementation. And now, as a result, Yarn can store the packages however is most convenient for Yarn and for the user. So let's think about what a better system might look like. Here's the way that Yarn Plug and Play lays it out. Yarn stores each package as a single file, a compressed zip archive in a dedicated Yarn cache folder. When Node needs a file from a package, Yarn intercepts the request, reaches into the zip archive, pulls out the requested file, then hands it to Node. Node gets the file that it wants, Yarn can do perfect module resolution, and everyone is happy. This system is so much more compact than traditional Node modules. It enables you to commit the package cache, like we saw there, to your Git repository. Yarn supports a workflow called zero install, where a repository can be cloned and then the application can be run immediately with no install step necessary. Now, I know what you're thinking because I am thinking it too. We've always been told that committing packages to source control is an anti-pattern, something we want to avoid. With node modules, that was absolutely problematic. There were so many files taking up so much space, but the plug and play cache is very compact, so it works quite smoothly. Now, zero install is not a required workflow. You don't have to commit your packages to package cache to your source control, but it's a really convenient, reliable workflow. That means that your builds are no longer dependent on an external package repository or network access for that matter. Everything that you need to build and run your application is part of the source control repo. In this scenario, you only need the package repository when adding or upgrading packages. Now, this has some really cool positive side effects. Switching between branches, forget having to do the package install step. The necessary packages are already there. Need to run some old code? Even if NPM disappeared entirely, your packages would still be right there. This also speeds up your continuous integration. The pipeline can clone the project and get right to work. Now, the bad news, not every project works with plug and play right out of the box. The Node ecosystem has been working with Node modules for a long time. Some packages and tools have come to expect that folder and have implemented code that wasn't compatible with plug and play. Another potential challenge is that plug and play is more strict than Node modules. The Node modules folder allows packages to reference other packages without specifically declaring them as a dependency. Doing this has always been an unsafe behavior. With plug and play, these unsafe access attempts are now called out as errors so that the package authors can fix them properly. The Yarn team has made huge efforts on fixing these kinds of problems in other popular projects, raising issues and then making pull requests to help bring those projects into compliance. The changes that they made benefit not just Yarn users, but all package users. Now, because of this, should you encounter an error using a certain package with plug and play, you should first check that you're using the most recent version of that package. Most popular libraries and frameworks are now compatible with plug and play, and many of them are moving to using Yarn Berry for building the projects themselves. Projects such as Babel and Jest are now using Yarn Berry internally. Now, there are a couple standouts that still don't support plug and play, namely React Native and Flow. Both of these are still completely compatible with Yarn Berry by using the built-in Node modules linker, which generates the classic Node modules folder. That's actually the default for an old project now. When you install, you'll see this later, but when we install Yarn Berry, it will default to using the Node modules linker. Let's talk real quick about upgrading to Yarn Berry with plug and play. Now, upgrading to your project to Yarn Berry is, for the most part, pretty simple, but like I said, making your project compatible with plug and play is the complex part. You should definitely try using plug and play if you can. It is wonderful and it makes lots of errors go away, but Yarn Berry also supports working with Node modules if necessary. If you have a relatively simple project, perhaps a simple React app or an Express server, upgrading to use plug and play may be trivial. That was my experience in some cases. Other projects may encounter more challenges, and I've definitely seen that. Another great feature of Yarn Berry, like we discussed, is that it's designed to be enabled per project. If you are upgrading a project to Yarn Berry, I highly recommend that you reference the migration docs. These docs have improved drastically over time. And I can tell you from experience, they are instructive and helpful when you encounter errors. We're going to take a look at those as well when we're doing the upgrades. So let's do a demo. I'm going to go ahead and switch to mirroring. So I have created a standard React app. We didn't create React app. Nothing fancy here. I used Yarn to create it, and so you'll see there is a Yarn lock file, and this has already been committed to source control. Nothing too interesting here. Let's take a look real quick. We'll see how much space the Node modules folder is using. So for create React app, 223 megs for Node modules. And just if we count the files in here, there's almost 33,000 files in Node modules. So cool. Now, so all our changes are committed, so that we're going to use commits to kind of track the changes that we're making as we go along. So in order to upgrade to Berry, we'll just say yarn set version Berry, and that will download the latest release of Berry, 3.2.1 in this case, and then save it into the project. You'll see we've added a yarn path to our yarnrc.yaml. We have added a package manager to package JSON. This is using taking advantage of core pack when it's available, which is a new node feature that allows you to specify your package manager. And then you can see in this case, it's actually downloaded yarn 321 and has installed it into the project. So we'll just commit this so those changes are saved. Now we're going to go ahead and do a new install with Berry. You see we're doing the resolution step, which is figuring out the packages that need to be installed. As you can see kind of on the edge here, the various yarn output. One thing you can do with these, if you plug these into yarn explain, which is a new command, it will tell you exactly what's going on there. So resolution is completed. It fetched all the necessary packages, and now it's doing a link step. Now the link in this case is with the node modules linker, which is the default for a existing project, is to copy those files into node modules. So we'll take a look here at the files, the changes that we have. You might see there are a lot of changes. So right now we still have our node modules folder. We have the yarn release yarn 3.2.1, and then we've got this interesting cache folder, which was created by Yarn. So before we do anything else, we're going to go ahead and grab a git ignore from the Yarn migration docs. So at this point, we need to choose our strategy, and we'll copy this here. So we're going to drop this into the git ignore, and then I will explain what's going on. Obviously, you want to comment your git ignore so you know what's going on here. So this is saying ignore everything in the yarn.yarn folder to start, but include the yarn cache and patches, plugins, releases, SDKs, and versions. So you'll see this releases here. We definitely want to include the pinned version of Yarn. It's also saying to include the cache. So this is a choice that you can make whether you want to keep that in or not. What this will do for you is you can use that regardless of whether you're using plug and play or not. If you commit the cache to your repository, that means that it never has to go out and fetch those packages when you clone the repo. They're just already there waiting to be installed. You can see those are zip folders, and so zip files, and so we can actually we can dive into those later. We'll do that when we're talking about the Yarn SDKs. So we'll go ahead and leave it like that, but we could choose to remove the Yarn cache. So it's no longer looking at those files. In that case, we only have 3, and that's our changes to the git ignore, our changes to the yarnrc.yaml, which specified a node linker of node modules, and then changes to the yarn.lock. You'll see that this is specifically versioned, and it is a true YAML file at this point. It used to be with Yarn Classic, it was kind of YAML, but there were some slight differences. So we'll go ahead and commit this as the Yarn Berry install. And then we will go ahead and let's go ahead and add that cache back in and commit those files too, because that makes things a lot easier. Cool. So just to prove that everything is still working with Yarn Berry, let's go ahead and do a yarn start. Now we haven't changed anything significant at this point. We're still using node modules, So there's no particular reason that you would have any problems. So here we go. You can see it's working well in the browser, no problem. We can also go ahead and check about the size of node modules, 268 megs in this case, pretty large. And then let's actually also check the size of that Yarn cache that we committed. So that's only 40 megabytes, which is, I think we would all admit, is quite a bit smaller. We can also count the number of files in node modules. In this case, there's 31,713, slightly different from before. I believe this is actually because of the upgrades to Yarn's resolution strategy to make it more reliable and better. And then we can look at the number of files in that cache folder. So only about 1,200 files in that cache folder. Not nearly as much as you would see if you were trying to commit node modules. All right. Now we start to get fancy. Now we try to, let's see if we can use plug and play with this. So once we remove that linker, that should default it to using the plug and play strategy, which means that it will no longer need that node modules folder. So you can see in this case, everything went super fast. There was nothing to fetch. It did a resolution, but because it already had that cache there, you can see it fetch completed in 251 milliseconds, and it built the project. So, all right, you'll see now it has generated this PnP.cjs file. That file exists to specify what is needed, how to do the module resolution. This is generated by Yarn, and this is what allows it to grab those files out of the zip at runtime. So, make sure I'm not off track on anything here. We've got the get ignore, we've discussed the files, and now we look at the cache size. So we can go ahead and commit these changes. Actually, we're gonna PnP install. All right. So let's make sure that everything still runs. Sweet, our create React app still works perfectly, no problems. We have no node modules folder, or it's very small at this point. I believe these are actually created by another thing in here, not specifically Yarn. And everything's working just fine. So we can also, if we want, test the other functionality. For instance, we can, instead of just doing a dev start, we can actually do a full production build. Now, in this case, it seems that we've encountered an error. And so let's take a look at this. Maybe we can do a quick Google and see what might be going on here. Sorry. So looks like we found pretty quickly a error describing exactly the same bug. You'll notice that it's talking about Yarn Berry, and we can see that people are discussing what's going on here. So people talking about attempted fixes, and what we'll discover is that essentially this is a mistake by the Create React App team. They have not they've not added the appropriate config to the file. So we're going to go ahead and add this package to it, and that should help things along. Super quick, no problem. Let's try and build again. So this is an outcome of plug and play being more strict in general. All right, at this point, our build is completed successfully. So that worked no problem. You can see that there's a slight change now to the PnP.cjs that helps it to locate those files. Also some new stuff in the package JSON and changes to the yarn lock. So we can go ahead and commit that. We'll be good to go. All right. What else do we want to look at? Oh, yes. So a really interesting thing is because most editors are set up to work with node modules, some of them may not work properly for certain scenarios. Like, for example, one that I encountered is Prettier. If you use Prettier in your projects, you might notice that the extensions don't quite work correctly. So there's an easy solution to that that's been designed by the Yarn team. We can just install the editor SDKs. So if we take a look here at our migration guide, or we'll take a look at our editor SDKs, very simple. We're going to say yarn SDKs VS Code, and that's going to install the SDKs for our favorite editor to make things work. Oh, I'm running this in the wrong place. Here we go. First, we go ahead and we say, all right, we're going to download and execute the Yarn packages SDKs. Okay, then we're going to say Yarn SDKs VS Code. See if that works. Well, I think I'm doing something wrong. What am I messing up here? I did this just recently. If we do this one. What am I missing here? Something silly. So, yes, okay, that's what we provide. I was copying the wrong code. Essentially, as we run Yarn DLX, which as I said, is the NPX equivalent. Now we can see that we've made some changes here to our VS Code extensions.json. These are both in that .vs Code folder. So this is going to install this zipfs and a couple others. You can see I've installed this VS Code integration into the project itself, so these things are going to prompt other users of the project to go ahead and install these packages to make their life easier. So this is all just set up to make it easier to manage the project, because this IDE expects you to have a node modules folder, which we've already discussed some of the problems inherent in that. So installed the VS Code SDK. One of the things that we can look at now is, for example, we can dive into some of these zip files in various ways. So if you have a listing where it shows you an error, you can actually dive into that zip file and it will allow you to access it, which I think is pretty darn cool. I also want to show off, if we take a look here at this Yarn explain, it'll tell you exactly what's going on in each step of the process. So this code is used to log regular messages, mostly to align all the lines. You'll see all these lines are similarly aligned, just really easy to read. And those brackets make it super simple to know what's going on there. We can actually scroll up a bit and see some other ones. For example, this one, and it'll tell us what is going on in that step. Missing peer dependency. So it's giving us a warning, hey, there's something wrong with your project. This project is a peer dependency, and it's not being fulfilled. We can also do things like yarn why. We can ask it to tell us why it's using a specific package if it is. And this tells us, hey, so Lodash is being imported by all these packages at these versions, and that's why you're seeing it installed. I think it's a really nice feature. So at this point, we've switched our app to Yarn Berry. We've migrated it to plug and play. Everything is working great. And we've installed our editor support. You'll see there's basically no node modules folder. That is actually some file. There is a small one here because those files aren't added by our package manager. And then we're using yarn to call everything. So in some cases, you may need to use package extensions, which is another scenario where your package, which is usually a scenario where your package is depending on something that it doesn't specify. And we just kind of have to paper over that for that package until they get that fixed in their code. All right. Questions about the demo? Cool. We'll jump back into a little bit more discussion, and then I'll let you all get to the party because I know that's what you're really excited about. Cool. So the question becomes, should you use Yarn Berry? And the first thing that I'd say is, yeah, if you are using Yarn, if you like Yarn, definitely consider, you should strongly consider upgrading to Yarn Berry. Yarn Berry is the currently maintained branch. It is going to be continually improved and developed upon, and you'll see the best performance and the best characteristics. That said, the next question becomes, should you use plug and play? Now, you should go ahead and try it at the very least and see if it works for your scenario without any problems. I have definitely encountered errors, like you saw there, that where something isn't working quite right, but I have usually been able to get through those errors without many problems. And if I did, I could file an issue or talk about it in the Yarn Discord and be able to solve that. It makes your life really easy in a lot of ways where you don't have to continually worry about blowing away your node modules or caching them in your CLI, your CI workflow. You can simply have your CI download your thing, maybe run a yarn install if you need to, but it will only take a second, and then go get right to work. So those packages are already included into your files. You should also consider adding that yarn cache folder to the, even if you're using the node modules, because Yarn will grab onto that and install those packages almost instantly. So I do like to talk about what makes Yarn different, because NPM is really still the default. A lot of people are pushing that direction. But I do love that Yarn is always innovating, pushing the boundaries, and not just accepting the status quo. That's something that I'm seeing a lot. Mael, the lead maintainer, really knows a lot about the package manager ecosystem and is focused on improving things and making things more reliable. They continue to release a solid, fast, polished package manager. You can see from the various commands they have and the output that it's really easy to work with and makes, in my opinion, the developer experience a lot better. So obviously, I think you should give Yarn Berry a try. It has a lot of great new features and the potential to make building node apps more convenient and more reliable. If there is something you don't like in Yarn, you can help to make it better. You can contribute to the project or even build a plugin. Now, I've contributed a few times myself by opening issues and making updates to the documentation. I've always found the Mael and the rest of the team to be helpful and eager to collaborate. They release copious documentation and release notes all the time. So actually we're coming up on the release of V4, which will change some things to make it easier to migrate, which is super cool. I want to thank you all so much for attending my talk. Feel free to reach out to me on social media and let me know what you think of Yarn Berry, and if you have any suggestions on how to improve this. I do also want to thank my employer, Kroger, for giving me the flexibility to come all the way here and present to you today. Cool. Any questions? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So if you use the plug and play strategy, you can avoid using the node modules folder. I'm sorry? Completely. Mm-hmm. So that's going to depend on a variety of things, but yes, if you're using plug and play, the linking process is just writing that JavaScript file. And if you're using 0 installs, you're checking in that file anyway. So there's nothing real new to create. You can literally, I've done this, clone the repository and do a yarn start, and it runs. Now, if you have packages that need built for that specific architecture, it's possible that you'll see that you need to run an install for that, or those kind of things. But in my experience, a lot of times you can just clone and run. Certainly, go ahead. We got plenty of time. Mm-hmm. I appreciate. I am. No, that's great. Excellent point. So there is a specific command for that. There's a yarn install verify cache, and that will check your entire cache and compare the checksums for each of those to the canonical version. And so they strongly recommend using that anytime that you're receiving PRs from an untrusted person. So if it's a maintainer or something, you're trusting them anyway as a general rule. And so you can usually accept their changes to the cache files. But in the case of a new committer or something like that, if they're making changes, adding packages, that kind of thing, you definitely want part of your workflow to be that verify cache. Now, in a company, you're gonna, you're kind of implicitly trusting them to start, but it's probably not a bad thing to run on occasion as well. Say that one more time. Yeah, so running the verify caches means that you are downloading those files again so that you can actually check the checksums of those files. Yarn will, on every install, is checking those file checksums. So if something does get corrupted, you'll know about that. If a malicious actor were involved, though, they could, as they were adding the package, just use the checksum from their package, right? And then it would be in that cache. And if you didn't verify the cache, you wouldn't detect that, because the standard install process is if you have that package cached, it's just going to use it, which makes a lot of sense. It's super fast that way. I think there's certainly, yeah. So I definitely get it. So there's a few things. Your CI gets a lot quicker, for one thing. You don't have to worry about downloading that. Because CI processes will cache your node modules, etc. But a lot of times, that's not perfect, or the cache goes away, or because of changes, it upgrades and stuff. It's not, the cache doesn't really match. So in that way, there's performance. Also, there's a reliability aspect. So whether you're using NPM or you're using a locally hosted version of NPM that you're proxying through or something like that, you're relying on that as part of your build process. So this, by checking in that cache, now you're removing a point of failure in that process. Also, you, for instance, in workflow, like switching between branches, I've encountered this a lot where I'll switch branches and then I discover, oh, I forgot to run, an install, or I discover I really have to delete my node modules as a result because something's just not right, and Yarn or NPM just can't get it right when it's using that, when the node modules are messed up like that. And so you rimwrap node modules and you keep on working, but that takes you a while. So with checking in that cache, especially if you're using plug and play, where that Yarn install is almost instant. Does that answer your question about why to check in the cache? So, and like I said, that is controversial. It is definitely not something you have to do. But if you have, particularly if you have a small project, it's worth giving it a try. We found it to work really well in our workflow, and we remove the Yarn install from the CI process and just go about our business. Mm-hmm. So as you can see, the file sizes are a lot smaller, and it's comparatively. Let's take a look at that. We can take a look at that output here, if you like. So, okay, I'm still extending. We'll bring that back. Okay, so scroll up here a little bit. Actually, we'll just run them again. How about that? So will you do it? Disk usage on the Yarn cache. So in that case, it's only 40 megs, which is not tiny, but it's also not huge compared to a lot of files that we deal with these days. And then we check into source control. I mean, we'll check in image files, even videos sometimes I've seen checked into a Git repository. And, you take, depending on the size of your photos, maybe 4 photos or 10 photos, something like that, in size. And it is a decent amount of files, but definitely not an outrageous amount. So if we look at file count on that cache, 1,200 files. Okay, it's a few, but I've seen code repositories with 100,000 files. And then so adding 1,000 to it is not going to be overloading for Git. I haven't encountered any problems myself. The Yarn repository actually uses this. If you go into GitHub right now and you look at Yarn Berry, we'll go right here. You'll see that they have their .yarn folder, and then they've got a cache folder. And right there is all the packages that Yarn itself depends on for building and maintaining and that kind of thing. So there was I'm not sure if it's mentioned in the documentation, but I did see a note at one point that the maintainer, he actually reached out to GitHub and was like, hey, is this going to be a problem? And they're like, no, you're fine, not a big deal. So I think that's a pretty ringing endorsement generally. So yes, I actually implemented at one point at an old job, deleting all the packages that we had checked into source control and then running that restore as part of the CI/CD process. And there's a few differences in that these files, those weren't zipped, for example. These are actually zipped files, so they're compressed, and there's just a single file per package. Any other questions? Love questions. Good stuff. Thank you. Well, who uses Yarn today? Anybody? All right, cool. All right. Do you also use NPM or just primarily Yarn? Okay, great. It works well, pretty well for you overall. All right. Mm-hmm. So I'd say performance, reliability, repeatability. So so you're no longer continually reaching out to the package repository nearly as much if you're checking in your cache. Um, and you you don't have this massive file structure that just always seems to cause problems. And so that reliability is there. Um, You know, I'm not sure. I think this is really interesting. I think it's groundbreaking, and I've definitely seen adoption come along for this because a couple years ago it was a big deal, but the 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 ecosystem keeps moving forward, and more things are adopting this. You'll see that they continually run um, uh, end-to-end tests against a lot of common projects to make sure that it continues working with plug and play. So I think that this could also be applied to other ecosystems as well. Yarn is actually designed in a way that it could work for other programming languages besides Node, but obviously the primary focus is Node. So it's something to try out at the very least. It's a very minimal cost. Frankly, just upgrading to Yarn Berry without considering plug and play at all is not, doesn't make your life harder really in any way. You get to use all the new features and a lot of, you can check in that cache if you'd like or not, or you can still prefer to use global cache. There's options to do whatever you like there. And you're gonna be able to use all the new features with Yarn workspaces, and I think the output is actually super helpful. The way that Yarn structures that and tells you what's going on. So if you have not used the version pinning thing, even if you decide to stay on the classic line, definitely at least pin your Yarn version. I don't know if you've ever encountered the scenario where somebody makes a change, somebody runs Yarn and it ends up updating the lock file in strange ways. And now you've got lock file conflicts. If you embed that version of Yarn, you just don't have those issues because everyone's running the same version all the time. Yes. So it's still a yarn.lock. You can actually change the name, interestingly enough, if you really prefer. And there's some reasons I've seen people do that. I haven't dug into it too much yet, but it's the format is just slightly changed. In the past, it was a YAML-like file, and now it is truly a YAML file. So you could parse it with a YAML parser if you'd like, but it is an updated version of the lock file. So, yeah. You can see where it's reaching that 3.2.1 Yarn version there from the releases. That help? Good. Awesome. Anything else? Anything else you want to talk about? We got a few minutes here if you want to chat, but cool. Yeah. You're welcome.